As you can probably tell by the title of my talk, I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction than many of the presentations today. I think that the recent interest in citizen science provides an opportunity to reflect on the important relationship between democracy and science. And I think more specifically, the relationship between values and facts. These are much more than idle theoretical concerns. I think these are concerns that cut to the core of some of the important questions that we need to grapple with in an era in which both the natural and social worlds are increasingly threatened by issues such as climate change and biodiversity loss, to list just a couple. A world in which science is increasingly politicized, but also a world in which politics is increasingly scientized. And by that I mean that politicians have a habit of hiding behind data, or the lack thereof, rather than making, I think, the important value judgments and political decisions that we need to make to take us to a more sustainable future. So my focus today is going to be, what does citizen science mean for the practices of science, for what we think about science, and perhaps for our own identities as experts? I want to tell you just a little bit about my research. I'm very interested in the relationship between publics and science, how those unfold historically, how that changes, and what that means in particular instances when publics participate with science. Now, one of the things that we're seeing that I think is quite interesting, if we take a broader look, is that there's a range of participatory trends in which we're seeing publics increasingly engage with science. These are being taken up at a time when scientific research is actually being pulled away from civil society through a lot of different trends. I'll just name a few. Increasing privatization of research, the commodification of knowledge, the constriction of knowledge production, often in the service of corporate motives that are increasingly transnational in scope. The relationship between science and society, to say the least, is fraught with tension. Particularly as sources of funding have shifted dramatically, and we've already alluded to those in some of our previous presentations. This is an example of a protest that was called the Death of Evidence that took place in Ottawa. Some of you may have followed this. In Canada, we are witnessing the censorship of public science as government officials set new restrictions on the mediation and communication of research, and in which we are seeing dramatic cuts to public science. Public debate is also hampered by spurious claims made by vocal industry groups, and those of you in the climate change community know that this all too well. It is a context, I think, that suggests that the ways in which we think about and enact citizen science really matter. One of the things that I have noticed in the citizen science community is that citizen scientists are asked to learn to think and behave according to the dictates of conventional science. Not only does this involve in learning the processes as well as the content of science, but for some commentators, it means developing the capacity to distinguish values from scientific knowledge. And some are concerned that citizen scientists will all too easily become advocates. That is, they will act as citizens rather than scientists in their public participation with scientific research activities. Now, my concern with this approach is that I think that it reinforces rather than calls into question what I'm going to call the dynamics of scientific separatism. And by that term, I simply mean the belief, and this is a deeply embedded belief, so I might be hitting on some of your beliefs, that science is and should be separate from society, that objective facts are and should be different from subjective values, and by extension, that science is the realm of facts and citizens represent the realm of values. And here we could tie a whole bunch of different things that are associated with values, like emotions, belief, worldviews, and politics. Now, some of the things that I'm going to say today are not new. They have emerged at various times over the past century, most recently in response to what has been called the participatory turn in scientific governance. So in the mid-1990s, a book came out called Citizen Science, written by a social theorist named Alan Irwin, and he raised a lot of the same concerns that I'm going to talk about today. I think one of our most amazing scientist/philosopher, Ursula Franklin, at the University of Toronto, has raised similar kinds of arguments that I'm making today. And if we go further back in time to the work of some of the scientific Democrats, like John Dewey, has made similar claims today. And the claims are as such: that we need to learn to think like citizen scientists, all of us, experts and citizens alike. Now, this is no small task, for in thinking like a citizen scientist, we blur the hard and fast distinction between scientists and citizens, between objective facts and subjective values, that has long informed a collective understanding of the relationship between science and society. So I'll pull up this old document. For much of the 20th century, science was perceived to be removed from the values, norms, and politics of society. And this is a document that has had an incredible influence on the science policy interface, written by a policy advisor, Vannevar Bush. And it was called Science, the Endless Frontier. And if you haven't read it, I suggest that you run home and read it. It's exciting. Actually, it's pretty interesting. It's a very interesting historical document. But what makes it really interesting is this idea that science is going to pave the way for historical progress. And in order for it to do so, it needs citizens to fund its activities. But it also needs to be left alone. It needs to be removed from the politics that citizens get involved in and that politicians also get involved in. It needs to be left to its own devices to define relevant areas of research, as well as to adjudicate the quality of its claims internally. And I think that this, among many other documents, has really led us to that particular dynamic of scientific separatism that I mentioned. Now, many commentators have argued that what has been called a social contract, this idea of the proper place of science in society, has changed. And it has changed dramatically over the past few decades. And there's many terms that have been bantered about. I'll throw some out. You may have heard of these. Mode 2 science, post-normal science, post-empirical science, civic science, and citizen science have all been these big umbrella terms that have said there's something changing about the relationship between science and society. And we need to figure out not only what that relationship is, but also perhaps to look at a different way of configuring that relationship. Now, to sum up what a lot of those terms mean, many have argued that in this new social contract, the production of scientific knowledge needs to be viewed as both transparent as well as participative. Now, citizen science is situated within attempts to put into practice this new social contract, particularly as the knowledge and values of a broader public are brought into what used to be a relatively closed institutional locus of power for developing knowledge. Now, the tendency is very strong, I think, for the democratic impulses of citizen science to be brought back into these conventional dynamics of scientific separatism. And I see this a lot in some of the work that I've been reading in citizen science. And this is just I'll just pull up this quote again. This is the researcher that I mentioned, Ursula Franklin. The task of the future, according to Franklin, is to build knowledge and understanding among and between citizens and scientists so that the distinctions between the two groups vanishes and so that both become citizen scientists, potentially able to solve our problems together. I want to do just a quick overview of some of the typologies of citizen science. And I've taken this from a wonderful report, Public Participation in Scientific Research, Defining the Field and Assessing Its Potential for Informal Science Education, that I believe Jennifer Shirk was involved in producing. And what I really like about this typography is that it gives us an understanding of the different types, a kind of a bird's eye view, if you will, of the different initiatives that are taking place within citizen science, and that also help us to understand some of the different ways in which we can think about participation. Now, the first one, the contributory types of citizen science, are perhaps some of the most dominant categories. These are programs that are designed pretty much by experts, and in which participants provide the data. So much of the research design, the questions that are asked, the kinds of protocols that are put in place by experts, and it's citizens who do a lot of the legwork. There are two other types of citizen science, collaborative and co-creative, and basically this just gives a little bit more leeway to participants to define the research questions, also to analyze the results. In co-created citizen science projects, there is much more active engagement of research, participants in proposing novel research, but this can also expose some of the limitations of existing scientific practices and paradigms. So some examples of this would be patient activist groups. A popular film of that would be Lorenzo's Oil. We have many DIY science groups that are actually challenging established practices of science. Now, what I want to call into your attention to is this certain model that has informed some, but not all, of citizen science initiatives, and that is the public understanding of science model. Now, the public's understanding of science model is simply that the public is deficit in knowledge and requires to be filled with scientific knowledge. And so that most of the initiatives are about a kind of knowledge transfer, a knowledge transfer of the right kind of information from experts to citizens. This movement, this public understanding of science movement, is also called the PUS movement, which is a terrible acronym. But I'll use it because it's fun. So the PUS movement has generated a lot of criticism, in large part because of its linear assumptions about the transfer of information from experts to lay people, as well as somewhat naive assumptions about the relationship between knowledge and trust. And the focus of PUS tends to be on the content of science rather than its process, the ways in which scientific questions are asked, answered, and debated. But another critique of the PUS movement is that it rests on a certain set of assumptions about citizens and the ways that their concerns have been represented by elite institutions. And again, it's premised on this assumption of scientific sufficiency, that there's nothing wrong with science. The only problem is the deficiency of the public, and that's what needs to get called into question. Now, many times where the focus of research tends to be on that public deficiency, what citizens need to learn, how they can learn more, and how we can design projects to bring them more into the scientific institution. These are really important endeavors. But what I want to think about as well is what we, not only in scientific institutions, those of us who call ourselves scientists, but also all of us have to grapple with scientific institutions. What citizen science can teach us about science. Rarely are experts asked about the ways in which their views have changed as a result of citizen science. What are their views about citizenship? What have they learned about the separation between scientific facts and social values? And despite much evidence to the contrary, institutions and cultures of science tend to prop up the idea that science is neutral in terms of values. Science, the argument goes, gets its authority from its separation of facts from fancies. Scientists need to take themselves out of the equation, suppressing their values in the quest for objectivity. And one of my colleagues regularly instructs his students, and he quite likes to say this, "In the lab, we are scientists, we are not citizens." From my opinion, I think this results in kind of a strange separation, and I would say even a strange amputation, whereby knowledge producers are asked to deny important parts of themselves, their emotional selves, their value-laden selves, their passionate selves, but also their collectively oriented parts of themselves. And they're asked to do this in the name of science. As a result, scientists are often reluctant, well, at least in public venues, to discuss the passions and loves and commitments that inform their work. But at a more basic level, we know that the choice of what constitutes data, which theoretical frameworks we deploy, which elements of research are represented, and which are left out of written work, those are all value commitments. Now, citizen science can show us not only that values are inherent in all forms of knowledge production and dissemination, and that's actually okay, but that values, and particularly democratic values, are good for science. As the philosopher Helen Longino argues, the values of truth, accuracy, honesty are integral to most notions of good science. And we should stop asking whether social values play a role in science, and instead ask which values and whose values play a role and how. And I want to leave by saying that citizen science can provide a way of reinvigorating democratic virtues that are in turn good for the practice of science. These virtues are an experimental turn of mind, skeptical questioning, respect for diversity, a recognition that truth is provisional. The very nature of citizenship, in fact, demands that we develop the skills, techniques, and compassions to deal with differences, and particularly differences in worldviews. The opposite is not true, however. The practices of science do not always converge with the aims of democracy and citizenship. Scientists can become complacent and indeed arrogant, occupying that privileged position of knowledge production. Expertise can carry with it blinkers and biases that can limit rather than enhance our collective knowledge about the world. And science can and has been put in the service of very anti-democratic forces, such as colonialism, imperialism, militarism, racism, sexism, and increasingly capitalism. Knowledge can all too easily be positioned as a commodity to be competitively pursued and accumulated, rather than as a public good to be shared and collectively produced. I'm going to leave you with a quote by a radical pedagogue by the name of Paulo Freire. And I've paraphrased this. Citizen science can either function as an instrument which is used to facilitate the integration of generations into the logic of the present system, or it can become a practice of freedom. I suggest that the practice of citizen science is one of embracing modest democratic virtues that are also scientific values. But to do so, it is important not to act as if society consists of interested and concerned citizens on one hand and dispassionate, knowledgeable scientists on the other. Rather, what we need for the struggle in front of us is the recognition that experts and non-experts alike are engaged in a historically unique and exciting process of becoming citizen scientists. Thank you.